Hi, my name is Jillian Gogel, and I am a senior student at George Mason University studying conflict analysis and resolution. Today I'm going to give you a little bit of information about my senior thesis project titled Rebuilding Broken Spirits, the Applicability of Trauma Healing in Post-Genocide Cambodia. I'd like to begin this presentation with a story. As is often the case with fateful conversations, after having devoted nearly 2 years of my studies to tackling the Buddhist peace-building processes in Cambodia, I actually had a remarkable conversation with Dr. Greg Stanton, who is a legend both here at SCAR and in the world of genocide studies and interventions. He gave me one important fact in particular, that the Buddhist peace-building processes with which I had been so completely enamored often did not work to the extent that they are typically romanticized, and in some cases even caused more harm than good. It was from this particular point that this project was born. I became determined not only to hopefully prove him wrong, but to discover the reality of the nuances that exist for peace-building and reconciliation in Cambodia today. Hence my research question. What is the contemporary role of trauma healing in post-genocide Cambodia since the 1991 peace accords? This question also has broader implications for the peace-building field in general, as it is critical we continue to ask where, how, and also why our work is being executed and accomplished in any context that is entered. Before we can properly look into the question of peace-building in Cambodia, I think first we need to have a better understanding of what actually happened during the genocide. So, Cambodia from 1975 to 1979 was actually under the influence and control of the Khmer Rouge, which was a communist-based regime. And by the time they left, and after about a decade of experience, Cambodia had actually lost between 1 to 3 million citizens to the violence of that genocide and immediate aftermath, and as well had experienced incredible amounts of internal displacement and also the creation of many refugees. So, because of all these things together, a national narrative characterized by ambiguity, uncertainty, doubt, and fear was created and began to instill a very deep-rooted trauma that actually affects plenty of the older generation in Cambodia today. So, taking a look at some of the literature existing on this topic, I think it's important to first define both trauma and trauma healing as, of course, the objects of this paper. So my research operates under the following definition for trauma, which is an overwhelming experience that can forever alter one's belief that the world is good and safe. So trauma, for better or for worse then, is a radical shift of sorts in an individual's worldview that may impede subsequent journeys through later stages of their lives. So accordingly, proponents of trauma healing argue that the practice is both more meaningful and more effective when it is grounded in an understanding of trauma as this individual phenomenon which I just mentioned. Although much of the scholarly discourse kind of implies that trauma healing is largely a collective-based practice, the critical perspective suggests that attention should be placed on both the individual and the communal levels. Finally, literature also shows that the function of trauma healing quote-quote practices tends to vary quite a bit across different cultural contexts, and then also depending on the specifics of the situation to which it's being applied. Therefore, it's actually kind of difficult to talk of any one type of trauma healing for any given scenario. Within the Cambodian context, therefore, some of the main types of trauma healing practices that exist have been situated in the Buddhist perspective, involve both individual and collective creative projects, and have dealt also with families actually as the units of focus for practice. So because this research project sought to collect evidence and draw conclusions from the data as I gathered it, I designed the project to be both fairly flexible and inductive, which allowed me room for the unexpected and to arrive at conclusions in much more organic ways. This project is obviously extremely subjective, and so I knew that I needed to keep myself on my toes at all times in order to perform the best data collection and analysis. Related to the flexible design is the fact that I really sought to gather a more phenomenological-based understanding of practitioners' experiences actually working in Cambodia. Although this perspective is very limited for a truly valid evaluation of trauma healing, I knew that this would be the most feasible way for me to personally begin this project with the time, resources, and contacts that I had at my disposal. The idea was to first hear what the people who were supposed to be doing the peacebuilding work had to say about what they were doing and what others were doing, as well as to listen for any more objective insights these subjective narratives might be able to provide. And for the sample itself, I actually used a Snowball referral sampling strategy. First and foremost, for the fact that I didn't have too many contacts who dealt with Cambodia to begin with. The two main contacts I have here at George Mason ultimately did help me out a lot in obtaining the rest of my sample. I got about 4 or 5 names from the two of them. But unfortunately, this is actually one of my limitations to this research, as I was only able to conduct about 4 interviews with the various people that I was pointed to. This is largely due to a lack of adequate response from those people that I did reach out to, or a lack of a timely response, which, given my extremely limited timeline of about 1 month for data collection, wasn't going to work. My actual data collection was done through a series of 4 Skype interviews, which were conducted over a period of about 3 weeks. The interview itself was divided into 3 sections. First, each interview's personal experiences. Next, their reflections on these experiences in the context of Cambodian peacebuilding. And third, their reflections on trauma healing overall and their potential connection to these last practices. And immediately after completing each interview, I sat down and took notes from memory on my initial thoughts and impressions, trying to get the most salient parts for me that I heard simply while listening. And then I listened to a recording I'd made of each interview, going through it an additional time, and I tried to note any recurring themes within each interview or similarities to the other interviews that I'd already conducted, especially as I finished more. My analysis of these interviews was definitely very interpretive, as I had done no prior coding, but I also wanted to preserve the subjective integrity of each interview as much as possible. Perhaps the most exciting part of this entire presentation, my findings. I am thrilled to have gathered the data that I did because of the richness and variance across the board with each interview that I had. So to start with, as I conducted each interview, I saw that each individual had their individual nuances, had their own specializations. They all did do work in a little bit different ways, even if some of their projects were associated. But despite these differences that could potentially skew data in completely opposite directions, they actually largely shared the same opinions and perspectives, which I thought was very interesting, and for me speaks to a greater phenomena happening in Cambodia as we speak. Some of the things that they agreed on and shared, as I found in the interviews, were first, almost all of them disassociated their personal work from the terminology of trauma healing. I had one person who worked closely for one big project with midwives who actually would go into families, deliver the children, and also share gifts across families. In a way, this was sort of like a community relationship building, and his work studied this. However, even though this was something he specialized in, he never associated himself with the exact term trauma healing. He never considered that work to be trauma healing. And I found that each of my interviewees also disassociated their work from trauma healing in similar ways. Also, I found that some people didn't claim to have too much knowledge about trauma healing, but as they spoke to me, spoke of processes and practices which, according to my research, would fit into the quote-quote trauma healing categories. But the biggest thing I think I found that each person basically shared was the fact that there is a huge discrepancy between the scholarly phrase and terminology of trauma healing and the reality of the practices on the ground. Scholars seem to be pointing to a process that was largely collective-based, what they call trauma healing, but in fact, although collective peace-building is, as these interviewees agreed, completely necessary for the country, hardly enough attention was given to individuals and the necessary changes that needed to take place with trauma healing on an individual level. And all of them always sort of spoke to the fact that the focus of peace and reconciliation in Cambodia was usually either inappropriate or ineffective, and that it really just needed to be repositioned in one way or another. Based on the findings I just discussed, I want to offer the following concluding remarks. So first, even speaking with just 4 practitioners and scholars of Cambodia, it is pretty evident that on a grander scale, trauma healing is very much so a multifunctional method of conflict resolution that is subject to the culture and context in which it's applied. This means, therefore, that future work in the trauma healing field needs to first and foremost be informed by a thorough cultural understanding of the region before it can begin to be effective. Related to this, trauma healing work as well as overall conflict resolution absolutely must take into consideration the gaps that constantly exist between scholarship and practice for both the region, conflict, and practice itself. This was, as I just mentioned, perhaps the biggest finding overall in this project, which for me points to the fact also that inadequate attention is given to this phenomena in both Cambodia and overall, and that our practices must be reformed around it. I also want to reiterate that this project, while I absolutely had big expectations for it, is extremely limited in both its sample and overall scope of focus. It is merely the minute beginnings of a much larger evaluative project in and for Cambodia that I really hope will take place in the years to come. And finally, I want to end with a truth to which I think this project speaks. Whoever we are and however we work, I have found it is important to remember the power of being present to all people in both addressing specific and true needs and informing the meaningful relationships, which is what I think truly gives the conflict resolution field its magic and rapport. Thank you guys very much for listening to my presentation. It was a pleasure to present, and if you all have any further questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me at the email provided here. Thank you all so much.